Very frequently, individuals come up to me and inquire about the specific origins of my thought process. They operate under the assumption that there is some hidden formula, a clandestine technique, or a mental shortcut that I simply stumbled upon along the way. However, the absolute reality of the matter is that I have never truly considered myself to be inherently brilliant or exceptionally gifted. The profound realization that I did eventually uncover, and believe me, it required a substantial amount of time to fully grasp this concept, is the fact that the vast majority of the population does not engage in genuine critical thought. Instead, they simply absorb and accept information blindly. Allow me to elaborate on exactly what I mean by that observation. Looking back to my childhood, right around the time I was perhaps 10 or 11 years of age, my father had a wonderful habit of taking me on long, wandering hikes deep into the Catskill Mountains. We would casually stroll through the dense forests, and he would frequently draw my attention to the various species of avian life up in the canopy. I distinctly recall one particular afternoon when he gestured toward a specific winged creature perched on a branch. He looked at me and asked, "Do you see that creature over there?" He then proceeded to list off its international translations. If you are speaking Italian, that is referred to as a ciutoto lapida. If you travel to Portugal, they label it a bombed, and over in China, they identify it as a chung longta. After reciting these variations, he would deliberately pause for dramatic effect and deliver a profound insight. At this exact moment, you possess the knowledge of what that creature is titled across a multitude of global dialects. Yet, you simultaneously possess absolutely zero actual knowledge regarding the creature itself. The only piece of information you have truly acquired is the arbitrary geographical labels that human beings have assigned to it. Now, if you take the time to truly observe that exact same avian creature, you will quickly notice a distinct behavioral pattern. It is perpetually pecking away at its own plumage. Why does it engage in this relentless grooming? The underlying reality is that there are microscopic lice actively consuming the essential proteins located within the structure of those feathers, and the bird is forced to meticulously remove them. These parasites devour the protein reserves. Subsequently, they reproduce and lay their eggs. This leads to an exponential increase in the lice population. Consequently, the winged creature is obligated to dedicate a staggering 50% of its waking existence simply attempting to maintain its physical hygiene. That specific paradigm shift remained permanently etched into my consciousness for the entirety of my existence. Comprehending the nomenclature of a given subject is fundamentally distinct from actually comprehending the subject itself. Tragically, a massive portion of what our modern society deems formal education is nothing more than an exercise in memorizing specialized terminology and attaching superficial labels. Conversely, authentic cognition, the act of genuine intellectual processing, requires one to continuously interrogate the underlying mechanics of what is factually occurring in reality. I started to recognize this widespread deficiency a bit later in life during my academic tenure at institutions like MIT and Princeton University. I found myself positioned in high-level, advanced physics lectures, surrounded by individuals widely considered to be among the most intellectually gifted scholars in the entire nation. We would find ourselves attempting to decipher incredibly complex subjects, such as the intricacies of quantum mechanics or the vast complexities of electromagnetic theory. The distinguished professor standing at the front of the hall would elegantly scribe sweeping, visually stunning equations across the chalkboards, and the entire room of students would meticulously duplicate these mathematical symbols into their personal notebooks. Inevitably, as the lecture drew to a close, a brave soul would elevate their hand and inquire, "Professor, could you please clarify the meaning behind this specific formula?" In response, the academic instructor would proceed to re-explain the concept, merely substituting the original symbols with an alternative set of mathematical jargon. The inquiring student would then nod their head, appearing completely satisfied by the exchange. Yet, I would be sitting in my chair, profoundly perplexed, internally questioning, "Hold on a second. What is the actual fundamental meaning here? I am not asking what the mathematical syntax dictates. I am asking what physical phenomenon is unfolding within the tangible universe that requires this exact mathematical description." You see, a monumental chasm exists between possessing surface-level knowledge of a topic and harboring a deep, intimate understanding of it. Furthermore, the vast majority of society, even those individuals adorned with the highest academic credentials, routinely conflate those two concepts. They operate under the delusion that merely being able to regurgitate information they were spoon-fed, successfully navigating a standardized examination, or reciting industry-specific technical terms is equivalent to genuine comprehension. It, emphatically, is not. Allow me to illustrate this with a concrete historical example from my own past. Following the conclusion of the war, where I was deeply involved with the development of the atomic bomb project out in Los Alamos, I relocated to the nation of Brazil to accept a position as a physics instructor at the university in Rio. It was an absolutely spectacular environment, populated by delightful pupils who exhibited an intense dedication to their scholastic pursuits. However, I began to observe a highly peculiar phenomenon. These dedicated scholars possessed the uncanny ability to recite entire, massive textbooks completely from memory. They had seemingly internalized every single word. Yet, the moment I posed a seemingly rudimentary inquiry, such as, "What exactly occurs if I project a beam of light through a Polaroid filtration device at a specific designated angle?" they were utterly paralyzed. They could not formulate an answer. They had genuinely never dedicated a single moment of internal thought to the concept. Their knowledge base was strictly confined to what the printed pages dictated would transpire, completely devoid of the underlying reasons or the broader implications of the phenomenon. I realized I needed to alter my pedagogical approach. I began phrasing my inquiries from a completely different angle. I would propose, let us completely disregard the academic literature for a moment. Envision yourself taking a casual stroll along the sandy shoreline, and you observe the brilliant rays of the sun bouncing off the surface of the ocean water. Why does that specific glare appear significantly more intense when viewed from certain vantage points? Once again, they were entirely unable to provide an explanation. They completely lacked the fundamental reflex to critically analyze the physical environment surrounding them. Their entire intellectual framework was built upon the deeply ingrained habit of memorizing external directives. That is when a massive revelation dawned upon me. The capacity for profound thought is not some innate genetic gift that you are miraculously born possessing. It is, in reality, a meticulously cultivated routine. And the tragic truth is that the overwhelming majority of humanity never bothers to develop this routine simply because no one ever takes the time to instruct them on the methodology. So that begs the ultimate question. How does one actively cultivate this intellectual habit? How do you effectively condition your own brain to engage in active, rigorous thought rather than succumbing to passive acceptance? The very first developmental strategy I adopted, and I must admit, I performed this rather organically during my youth without recognizing its profound uniqueness, was the practice of perpetually translating newly acquired information into a tangible format that I could visually perceive, physically interact with, or vividly simulate within my imagination. Whenever an individual introduced me to the concept of atoms, I absolutely refused to simply memorize the textbook definition, stating that atoms are minuscule particles that make up physical matter. Instead, I would actively conjure a mental picture of them. I would visualize these microscopic entities wildly ricocheting around their environment, violently colliding into one another. I would actively pose hypothetical scenarios to myself. If I possessed infinitesimally small eyes and had the ability to watch atomic behavior, what exactly would be playing out before my vision? Years later, while deeply immersed in the rigorous physics curriculum at MIT, I applied this exact same imaginative framework to complex equations. Many of my peers genuinely suspected that I was intellectually slow, primarily because while they were frantically racing through endless arrays of problem sets, I would be found sitting completely motionless, occasionally for multiple hours on end, doing nothing but intently staring at a single formula. I can assure you, I was not being sluggish. I was actively engaging in translation. I was rigorously interrogating myself, asking, what real-world dynamic process is this mathematical equation actually describing? If I had the ability to observe this phenomenon unfolding in real life, what visual evidence would I witness? Sometimes I would even invent strange, miniature fictional scenarios within my mind. For instance, when I was initially diving into the complexities of electromagnetic fields, I imagined I was exactly the size of a singular electron, drifting endlessly through the void of space. What physical sensations would I experience if an opposing electrical charge drifted into my immediate vicinity? By what mechanism would I be alerted to its presence? What invisible force would physically push or pull on me? This imaginative process may sound incredibly childish, perhaps, but the reality is that it was remarkably effective. The simple truth is that the moment I was able to successfully render a concept visually within my head, I fundamentally grasped it. And once that level of profound comprehension was achieved, the information became permanently locked into my memory. Here is the monumental secret that nobody tells you. You cannot think clearly about something that you are entirely incapable of visually rendering. Regrettably, the vast majority of the population entirely skips that foundational step. They absorb the highly abstract concepts first, the complex formulas, the sophisticated technical terms, the overarching theories, and they completely fail to invest the effort required to connect those abstractions to anything tangibly real. Consequently, these concepts aimlessly float around inside their consciousness, disconnected and utterly meaningless. And then these same individuals are baffled as to why they forget everything a mere week after their exam. The subsequent strategy I learned, and this admittedly took me a longer period to master, was the relentless practice of asking why. I am not talking about asking it merely a single time, but over and over again, in a looping manner reminiscent of a child. In all honesty, children are absolutely brilliant at this specific intellectual art form. A child will ask you why the sky is blue, and you will respond by explaining, it is because of the way light scatters in the atmosphere. The child will immediately counter with, but why does the light scatter? You will then attempt to clarify, well, because air molecules are small and interact with light waves. Unfazed, the child will push further, demanding, why exactly do they interact? This cyclical interrogation will persist relentlessly until you finally admit that you do not actually know the answer. Somewhere along the line, we lose that trait. We develop a paralyzing sense of embarrassment regarding our need to ask basic questions. We harbor a deep-seated fear of looking stupid. As a direct result, we simply nod our heads and project a false facade of understanding. However, operating in this manner is a total disaster, because if you fail to comprehend the foundational bedrock, absolutely everything built on top of it remains incredibly shaky. I clearly remember a time when I was instructing at Caltech, and a student approached my office, visibly confused about quantum mechanics. He openly admitted, "I do not understand the uncertainty principle." I responded quite simply saying, "All right, explain to me what your personal interpretation of it is." Almost instantaneously, he launched into a robotic recitation of the standard textbook definition, mentioning the correlation between position, momentum, and Planck's constant. I immediately intervened and halted his recitation, stating, No, do not tell me what the printed book says. Tell me what you personally think is physically happening." And he was rendered speechless. He literally lacked the capacity to tell me because he had never dedicated a solitary second to actually pondering the mechanics. He had merely memorized it. So we both sat down and I guided him. "Let us start incredibly simple," I suggested. "Forget quantum mechanics for a brief second. If you wanted to precisely measure the physical location of an object, like a ball, what specific actions would you have to take?" He thought for a second and replied, "Look at it." I affirmed his answer. "Right, and how exactly do you look at something?" We meticulously worked through the logical progression. Light bounces off the surface of the ball and enters your eye. You then see where it is located. Then I introduced the pivotal twist. Now, what if the ball is extraordinarily, incredibly small, so minuscule that the microscopic light you utilize to observe it actually physically pushes it when it bounces off? In that exact instant, I watched the physical expression on his face transform. He completely got it. This breakthrough did not occur because I provided him with a superior academic definition, but rather because he had finally thought about what was actually occurring in reality. This is the grand secret, if there truly is one. Never accept anything as truth until you possess the ability to explain it to yourself, utilizing your own unique vocabulary, relying on your own personal mental pictures, and constructing your own analogies. If you cannot successfully do that, you simply do not understand it yet. and that is perfectly okay. But whatever you do, do not pretend that you do. The third major principle I adopted, and I would argue this is potentially the most critical component of all, is that I aggressively learned not to be terrified of not knowing. While this concept may sound incredibly simple, it absolutely is not. The overwhelming majority of the human population is absolutely petrified by the prospect of admitting they are confused by a topic. They operate under the delusion that admitting ignorance makes them look dumb, so they resort to faking it. They nod along in agreement. They strategically use the correct vocabulary, completely masking the fact that they do not really know what those specific words actually mean. But here is what I ultimately figured out. The absolute smartest action you can possibly take is to openly admit when you are clueless about a specific subject. Because the exact moment you confess it, you unlock the doorway to start actually learning it. Conversely, if you pretend you already possess the knowledge, you become hopelessly stuck. You stop asking questions entirely. You terminate all active thought. I used to sit in specialized seminars at Princeton and Caltech, where an immensely famous physicist would deliver a highly technical, profoundly advanced presentation, and the entire audience would sit there nodding, as if they understood every single word. While perhaps a small fraction of them genuinely did, I certainly did not always understand. So I would confidently raise my hand and pose a highly basic question. Occasionally, people would look at me as if I were a simpleton. But do you want to know the incredible reality of those situations? At least half the time, following the conclusion of the lecture, 3 separate individuals would quietly approach me afterward and say, "Thank God you asked that question. I didn't understand it either." The stark truth of the matter is that a massive percentage of what passes for elite expertise is simply individuals engaging in sophisticated pretending. They have successfully learned the linguistic structure of their field. They know precisely which buzzwords to use, yet they lack even a rudimentary understanding of what they are actually talking about. And identifying these individuals is incredibly simple if you listen closely, because the moment you ask them to explain their theories simply, they absolutely cannot. They frantically retreat into impenetrable jargon. They intentionally make the subject sound overwhelmingly complicated because they themselves are profoundly confused. Because of this, I established a strict personal rule for myself. If I find myself entirely incapable of explaining a concept to an incoming college freshman, to a young child, or to an individual with absolutely no background in the subject matter, then I simply do not really understand it myself. And that is totally fine. That merely indicates that I need to dedicate significantly more time to thinking about it. There is one final element to share, and while it might come across as slightly strange, it has proven to be immeasurably useful throughout my journey. I actively taught myself to deeply enjoy not knowing, to actually find a genuine, thrilling sense of excitement whenever I encountered a concept I did not understand, because that simply meant there was something completely new to figure out, a brand new puzzle to play with. Back when I was stationed at Los Alamos during the global conflict, our entire team was working incredibly hard, enduring agonizingly long hours under high-pressure conditions. We were, after all, attempting to build an atomic bomb, and I was rapidly getting burned out. I began to feel like the entire field of physics had transformed into this heavy, hyper-serious burden, entirely comprised of rigid equations, complex problems, and crushing pressure. Consequently, after the war ended and I returned to Cornell University, I made a conscious decision. I was simply going to play. I was absolutely not going to worry about conducting highly important work or rushing to publish prestigious academic papers. My sole objective was just to think about whatever subject happened to seem interesting at the time. I vividly recall a specific day spent in the university cafeteria. A young kid randomly threw a dining plate high into the air, and I immediately noticed that the plate was distinctly wobbling as it spun. Printed upon this dish was a brilliant blue medallion, Cornell's official logo, and I observed that the central medallion was rotating at a significantly faster rate than the overarching wobble of the plate itself. An internal spark ignited, and I thought to myself, I genuinely wonder why that happens. So I retreated to my private office, and purely for the sheer fun of the exercise, I worked out the mathematical equations. Why exactly does a flying plate exhibit that specific wobbling behavior? What is the precise mathematical relationship linking the wobble to the rotational spin? As I peeled back the layers of this problem, it surprisingly turned out to be intimately connected to some incredibly deep, foundational principles regarding rotation and angular momentum. And that highly specific, silly little puzzle that I engaged with purely because it seemed fun eventually paved the way for the advanced work that ultimately contributed to my Nobel Prize many years down the line. But obviously I possessed absolutely zero knowledge of that at the time. I was not intentionally trying to execute monumental work. I was merely playing. I was just allowing myself to be curious, and I firmly believe that is perhaps the truest, most profound secret to it all, if I am being perfectly honest. You cannot violently force your brain to operate like a genius. You simply have to let yourself be relentlessly curious, just like a child. You actively ask questions. You constantly try to see what is genuinely happening behind the scenes instead of just passively accepting the narratives you are told. You enthusiastically admit when you fail to understand something, and you persistently keep thinking about the problem until you finally do. The tragedy is that most people voluntarily stop themselves before they even reach the starting line. They allow their inner monologue to dictate, "Oh, that subject matter is vastly too complicated for me." Or they think, "I am simply not smart enough to process that, so I will just trust the designated experts." However, true understanding has almost nothing to do with raw intelligence. It is entirely about being wildly persistent. It is about caring deeply enough to actually sit down and think about something, rather than taking the lazy route of acceptance. I have spent the entirety of my life surrounded by some of the most extraordinarily brilliant minds on the planet. I am talking about decorated Nobel Prize winners, brilliant mathematical savants, and incredible physicists. And do you know what the ultimate takeaway is? While a select few of them were genuinely, innately brilliant, the overwhelming majority of them were simply regular human beings who adamantly never stopped asking questions. They were individuals who fiercely refused to accept a concept just because the rest of the herd did. They were the ones who stubbornly kept thinking about complex problems long after everyone else had lost interest and moved on. You are incredibly capable of doing exactly that. Absolutely anyone can execute that mindset. You do not need to be genetically special. You only need to care enough to actually try. Therefore, the very next time someone attempts to present you with a piece of information, absolutely anything, it entirely does not matter what the subject is. Do not just blindly accept it as truth. Pause and actively ask yourself, what does that statement actually mean in reality? Am I capable of picturing it in my mind? Can I successfully turn around and explain it to somebody else using only my own words? If the answer is no, then you simply do not really understand it quite yet. And that is a perfectly beautiful thing, because that moment of realization is exactly where the true process of thinking finally begins.